Okay, we're live. Good afternoon. Scott, Luton and Greg White with you here on Supply Chain Now. Welcome to today's live stream. So on today's show, we're talking with a couple of industry leaders from across the pond based in the London area. And we're going to be talking about two main topics. First up, remote working during this challenging environment, right? A lot of opinions there, a lot of best practices, a lot of challenges for sure. And then secondly, we're going to be talking about the supply chain workforce, the brave warriors out there that are keeping global supply chains moving, especially with a lot of the critical goods that many consumers still need despite the environment. So quick programming note before we get started. If you enjoy our live stream episodes, be sure to check out our podcast. Right now, we're publishing a daily podcast. In fact, today we published an episode from a diverse manufacturing and supply chain alliance event back in February, where we featured Mark Manning with iTrace Technologies in a fascinating conversation, a lot about blockchain and many other supply chain topics. So you can check that out wherever you get your podcast from. So I want to welcome in my esteemed co-host here today, Greg White, a serial supply chain tech entrepreneur and trusted advisor to many, many companies. Greg, how you doing?
I'm doing great. As you can see, I dressed up for the occasion.
You did.
I wore a clean and brightly colored T-shirt. I feel like we need some color in our lives these days.
Well, it is Easter week, and I thought you were dressing up as an Easter egg.
Well, I feel like I've worn nothing but gray and black T-shirts for the last several weeks. So
right.
Time to step in.
Well,
spring break here too, so I put on some sunscreen and I'm pretending like I'm at the beach right now.
Good. Hey, when you're the Atlanta tennis champion, you can do whatever you like to do. We got a great show lined up. We've got a couple of friends that we have been fortunate to collaborate on through a number of different projects. And let's go ahead and welcome in them in, Greg. Jamie Harding and Nick Stylianou, both are members of the A team over at EFT by Reuters Events, which is, if you're one of the three people that don't know, the global leader in business intelligence and C-level networking for the transportation, logistics, and supply chain industry. Nick and Jamie, how are we doing?
Yeah, very good. And I have decided to dress up today. When I'm working from home, I don't normally put on a shirt, but I thought I'd come on and impress you guys. So the three of us are in the blue shirt brigade, and you've got on some orange to kind of stand out a little bit.
Yeah, very good, right?
Well, Jamie, I thought your kind of costume as a ninja. You're kind of into shadows today.
Yeah, I know. I've had to just kind of find a space. I commandeered a spare bedroom for my office for this period of time. And so this was probably the best position to do a live broadcast from.
Appropriate for the topic today.
The shades seems to have just come in at the last minute here.
Hey, all in good fun. Hey, if that's your biggest problem this week, I think we're sitting good. So great to reconnect with both you, Jamie, and Nick. Okay, so Greg, as with all of our guests, we really want, before we dive into the subject matter, remote working and supply chain workforce and some updates there, we want to give our audience the opportunity that we've enjoyed so much, which is getting to know Jamie and Nick better. So Jamie, if you would tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your professional journey.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the business information world, I suppose, for a few years now. And essentially what I do is research. So we and Nick and I are in the same kind of role. We speak to folks in the industry on a daily basis. This week I've spoken with people at Walmart, Adidas, Target, and these kind of organizations. And essentially why I do that, I need to understand, what they're going through at this time and other times to make sure that the content we produce is really kind of on the pulse of the industry and hitting the nail on the head, and recreate that in the things that we do from webinars to reports and the various kind of content that we kind of create in our portfolio. And now of all times, it's more important than ever. Supply chain is more important than ever. And so the platform that we have and the platform that you guys have too for sharing ideas and this kind of information is absolutely vital right now. So that's the long and short of it, really.
Outstanding. Well, really appreciate what you do. I think, as we've heard from all corners of the world, business leaders, business professionals, supply chain professionals, all are looking for great content and great and accurate information right now. So I can appreciate what you're doing, Jamie. Hey, Nick, great to see you again. We really enjoyed our partnership going back a couple of years now, it seems. Tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
So yeah, first of all, it's really great to be on the live stream today. As Scott said, this is a partnership we've enjoyed now for I think around 18 months. So we've been really part of the journey from the early days of Supply Chain Now Radio to what it is now. So yeah, in a nutshell, kind of echoing what Jamie says, in a very similar role, doing a lot of research right now into the current challenges that a lot of supply chain leaders are facing. I mean, we use the word unprecedented a lot right now, but we are really in unprecedented times. And I think a lot of the leaders that we're speaking to are really confused about what's going on, and need this critical business intelligence to really inform their strategies going forward. So I think things like this, upcoming webinars, reports that we have coming up, are really important to helping the industry going through this very challenging time.
Yep, absolutely. So Greg, last time that we saw Nick in person was when we were in Austin, Texas at a great event focused on technology leadership and supply chain. From your point of view, being the technology entrepreneur that you've been, speak to, what you've seen dynamics wise with the EFT by Reuters events and what they bring to the table.
Well, look, there are a lot of opportunities for you to spend time. So I was often recruited into these things to either speak or to have my company exhibit and attend. And what I've seen that EFT and Reuters does in particularly well is they draw some of the best people in terms of providing information and give you really strong opportunities to network. When you go to a live event, which seems like it hasn't happened forever now, but when you go to a live event, one of the best things that you can do is learn from others, and network with others. And I've just seen EFT and Reuters be able to do that in such an exceptional fashion. They pick great venues, great towns, just the right size of event so that you can get to talk to virtually everyone.
We were also really proud to have EFT by Reuters events help us and support our Stand Up and Sound Off platform, which we held a couple weeks ago, which drew almost 500 registrants from across the world. They're all looking to see how supply chain leaders were navigating through these times. So really appreciate what y'all do to help others that are all in the trenches together. Okay. So now we want to shift gears a little bit, and we want to dive into this topic that everybody is dealing with right now, which is remote working. So let's first talk about the transition that we've all made, most of us. I mean, we're going to talk about the supply chain workers that are still doing, fighting a good fight out there.
Right.
Let's talk about the transition to remote working that so many of us have gone through. Nick, why don't you start us off? Talk about that transition and what it's meant for you and your team, and kind of what you're hearing out in the marketplace about the transition and about its impact on productivity.
Definitely. So I guess, first of all, talking from our company's perspective, I say that we're a very sociable team. So we have quite a small team, around 10 people in our kind of this department specifically. And, very, very sociable team, chat to each other all the time, very reliant on that face-to-face. So that the transition to remote working using the various software platforms that are out there, video conferencing, etc., it has been a challenge, and replicating those face-to-face discussions where you might learn a few things, think of a new idea, is challenging, and it's something that we've had to adapt to over the last few weeks. And I mean, that's something that obviously all companies across the world are facing right now. I know some companies we've been speaking to transitioning 98% of their workforce suddenly to remote working. So I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of the implications of this and the impacts. We've already kind of seen preliminary reports on productivity and things like that, but it'll be interesting to see whether historically, I guess employers haven't necessarily trusted their employees to work that much from home. Whether they'll be on Netflix or their Xbox when they should be working. So I think the trust element is so crucial, and I think this period is very important to inform us on whether this is something that maybe is here for the longer term rather than just a short term.
Yeah. So Jamie, I want to get you to weigh in on the same topic, the transition, and how organizations and teams are navigating that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, initially the transition was kind of fortuitous for me, to be honest, because the day before we got the call to kind of work from home, Nick and I had placed a bet, and the next day I was due to come into the office in full soccer kit because we support opposing soccer teams, and my team had unfortunately lost. So, fortunately enough, we worked from home, so I got to null and void that bet for the time being, at least. But we joked at the top about the kind of wearing this blue shirt or whatever. But I do think it's one of those things you have to kind of bake in processes, whether that be wearing professional clothes or orchestrating some kind of morning routine or fake commute to work to kind of bring yourself up to the level of productivity you would otherwise be in, and that can represent different things to different people. You know, I've spoken with a number of people this week who, you know, are literally putting on suits and ties and sitting in their kitchens at home. Others are walking up and down the stairs for kind of 20 minutes to recreate what would be some semblance of a commute, because it's really difficult to, I think, break or decide between what's work and what's home at the moment, because you can literally roll out of your bed and within 20 seconds you're at your office. And so creating those things to create that difference, I think, is really important. So morning routines, getting dressed up, I think is a good one. But someone on the phone to me today said they put in a call with someone sociably at 6:30 at night, because on the other end of the coin, you could find yourself being inefficient and dragging things out because you ostensibly have all night to do things because you don't have that cutoff from the office. But if you create that kind of cutoff whereby you're giving yourself something else to do at the end of the day, you're creating kind of efficiency by structure. So there's a number of ways I think that it's important to create your day around a separation between business and work. So you're being efficient when you're at work, whether that be, some people probably are working from their bedrooms or their kitchens, and having that leisure time as well. So cutting that off.
Good stuff, Jamie. All right, so Greg, I want you to weigh in on the same question, that transition to remote working, and then take us right into the next topic we're going to talk about,
Sure.
which is its impact on working dynamics.
So, I empathize with people who have the struggles. We've heard a lot because of the companies that we work with. Frankly, for me, I have been working off and on from home for almost 20 years. So I have gone through ages ago what a lot of people are going through now. I can tell you that exactly what Jamie was suggesting is have a morning routine just like you're going to the office. If you're off, if your commute is making the bed and sitting down at your desk, or it's walking upstairs to your office or whatever it is, that's what has worked for me for off and on for a lot of years. So that's really good advice. I think, that what we're seeing is, in addition to the trust issues and productivity and the maybe in some cases too constant check-ins, the ability for companies to connect has been a bit of a difficulty. And we're going to talk about a little bit about that in the future. But, we heard about early on in Georgia, before the mandatory work at home thing came down, that they had to wait until some of the critical companies had the infrastructure to do so. So there are all kinds of things to think about when you go through this. So, sorry, say that again.
Yeah, just as a point on that, I think something that can't be underemphasized is kind of the social aspect of work, of the enjoyment. In Britain, we'd say the banter aspect of things, that office dynamic that I think is so critical, and it is really, really hard to replicate that. And I know there's a lot of concerns around mental health, mental well-being of certain people that are quarantining at home on their own or with one or two people, and it is very easy to feel quite lonely in these times, especially with everything that's going on and feeling overwhelmed with what's going on in the world. So I feel like those more jovial aspects of working the happy hours, the drinks at at lunchtime or after work or whatever, or lunches with the team, is something that is hard to replicate. But I know that it's something that we've done internally. Try to scheduling a coffee at 3 o'clock, or do a pub quiz on a Friday night, so people don't just feel like they're doing one long week of working, where they're that sociable, enjoyable aspect of work is maybe missing from the remote aspect of things.
Well, there are other productivity aspects as well. I mean, I call it standing around the water cooler, which, right, you don't just happen by someone in the hallway and go, hey, that thing we were talking about, I've got a good idea. It's harder to make that kind of communication happen as well, and it slows the dynamic of companies. I mean, the last company I just exited in February of last year, we had a virtual workforce, though we did stuff about 5 or 6 people in the office, and then we had a day a week where we tried to get everyone in the office. You could literally watch the productivity increase. And I don't mean people got more work done. I mean, people shared more ideas, and you got more opinions on things if you had a problem. We did have this fun dynamic because it was a small company, that if you had a joy or a woe or an aha moment or something like that, we had a whiteboard, with a hashtag startup life on there, and people could go up and put a tick mark up there and explain it to the whole group, or not, or shed tears or shout from the rooftop or whatever. But you kind of lose that kind of thing in this sort of work environment.
So interestingly, sorry.
Oh, so on that note, because this next topic, I think, will be in parallel what we're already talking about, and I'd love to get y'all's take on long-term dynamics and long-term prospects for working remotely. And before we do that, I came across something on Twitter where it's surprising just how much information you can gain on Twitter, by the way. So Eric Stromberg, and when we're talking about some people's take on remote working post this challenging time, Eric Stromberg had a great tweet. He said there's 2 categories of people. Number one, those that think COVID-19 will spark a Zoom-fueled remote work from home utopia, or the second category, those with young kids. And that, I don't know about y'all, but that resonates with me. So, but kidding aside, let's talk about the long term.
Yeah.
Nick, if you would speak to, are we going to see a long-term rise in remote working?
So I think that's a really good question. To answer your previous point, Greg, or just to kind of come back on that, I was speaking with a big e-commerce company last week, and on their Slack channels, they've actually created a coffee channel, I think. So whenever people go and make a coffee, they go onto this channel, and so it's literally kind of recreating that kind of water cooler in the office to kind of make sure they're having that kind of organic place to share ideas. And apparently that's worked out really well. It's not something that we've trialed in-house, but I got good feedback on that call last week. But to answer this question specifically, I think it's to be seen, and I wouldn't necessarily think there's going to be a reactionary or a sudden shift towards broad scale remote working. But that said, what I think it's bringing into the focus is the importance of software-based communication. Had this level of disruption happened 6 or 7 years ago, the transition to working from home would have been much more complex. The software that we're using to have this conversation now, softwares like Zoom or other competitors, have been so vital to make sure operations can still run relatively efficiently. And I think so what this disruption is doing is making sure that businesses who maybe weren't set up on those kind of systems are doing so, and it's been a catalyst for technology-driven working for sure.
Yep. So real quick, before we get Nick to weigh in here, big shout out, Umit, thank you for joining us. He's been on most of our live streams, I think, already. And Asif, Nick and Jamie's colleague, really is enjoying this component of the conversation. So hello to you, Asif. All right, so
and
Nick,
working from home, I presume, right?
Nick, what's your take on the long-term prospects of working remotely?
I think something that obviously needs to be said is kind of the impact of having a very large office space in London, with exorbitant rental costs, very high upkeep rates. Is it a necessary expense to have a lavish office in central London? Do you need that anymore, or can you maybe downsize, have a smaller office in maybe somewhere cheaper part of the world, and rely on the remote working? I think that is a conversation that a lot of people are having, and I think maybe that's the trend that we'll see long term is a movement away from the large scale buildings where you have thousands and thousands of employees, because it is super expensive.
And Greg, what's your take?
Well, it's interesting because the last company that I had, what we did was deal with a lot of property management. And one of the concerns that they had, and one of the reasons they wanted to use our tool set, was because they were concerned about these phantom leases where there's a lease still there, but they believe that the space was unused. And their concern was that there were literally millions of square feet unused but still being paid for, and they wanted to get eyes on whether that space would be released at the end of the current lease term. So there has been this concern for a while, and the trend towards work from home, particularly in large cities where this doesn't translate to around the world, but just in Atlanta, Class A square footage is in the $50 to $75 a square foot range. So that's expensive. Just 4 years ago, it was closer to the 24 to 30 range, to give you an idea. So I believe that there will be some companies that go that direction. I believe that we've already heard of some companies that intend to move more people to work from home, if not all of their people to work from home, on the backside of this. But I don't know that we can know whether it's going to catalyze and expedite a process that companies already had in place. I don't know if a company is going to go through a complete transition in what will, by the time this is over, be a relatively overnight time frame, right? Let's say this lasts for a full quarter. That's still a relatively short time frame in the span of a company, and I'm just not sure that that's enough to get them going that direction.
All right, good stuff. Hamant was asking about what we're talking. The topic of the discussion, we're talking about remote working and its impact on industry on the first half of this live stream, Hamant, and we're going to be talking about the supply chain workforce in the second half. And on that point, to our audience, weigh in. We're going to try to get you all involved as much as possible. Share comments, share questions. This live stream is about our audience as much as it is our featured guests here, Nick and Jamie. Okay, caveats on remote working. Greg, what are you curious to get Nick and Jamie's take on caveats of remote working?
Yeah, I mean, look, guys, not everybody has space. They don't have the capability. We alluded to this in earlier in the show, that, for instance, big power companies and other critical services don't have the secure ability to provide a remote VPN, a virtual private network, that creates security for every single worker at their home. And you guys have alluded to the fact that there may be people with less strong connectivity or very, very weak connectivity. So we can't really assume that everyone can do that. So how do you see that impacting work?
Yeah, just I guess to that point, obviously Jamie and I are in London, and there's a lot of people that are working from home, obviously, and there's also a lot of people that aren't working and that are having to fill their time in other ways. They're on Netflix watching Tiger King, which is obviously consuming a lot of the internet, right? So it's about how do you still maintain productivity while the internet might go down. I mean, just in my team personally, with a couple of colleagues. I know that, internet's gone down during meetings, internet's gone down during calls. They've had to, restart the router. They've had to, buy 4G while their router's being delivered. So I feel like a lot of the things that we take for granted, like having a stable internet connection, like having a desk, like having, a laptop stand. I know like Jamie's using all sorts to a couple of books or something to get that stand replicated that he has at work. So it's just, how do you still maintain that productivity? You can't just assume that everybody has the resources. Obviously, not everyone has a great internet connection, and not everyone has the capacity to ultimately be productive. They're having to work out of their bedrooms or in their bathrooms or in their kitchens. So it's just that understanding, and I think that there is more understanding. There's more empathy around the struggles that people are going through in this very unique and unprecedented time. As kind of cliche as that is to say right now.
Nick, do you see companies starting to alleviate that? If, as we talked about in the previous segment, companies are going to start to move their workforce home, do you see them helping home workers to augment their connectivity and security tools at their homes?
Yeah, I mean, us personally, we're quite fortunate. We have a really good IT team that is very helpful with a lot of these things. Not everybody is tech literate. Not everybody does know how to, sort out the Wi-Fi when it goes down. So I feel like you need that infrastructure, that support. And at least from our personal perspective, Jamie and I are lucky to work with a team that is very helpful. They are available on our instant messaging platform that we use internally to help you through a lot of these things that to them, I'm sure, does seem very stupid. But to us, as maybe not tech aficionados, it's very helpful.
So Hamant, who's part of our audience here today, appreciate this comment here. He mentioned his company gave him VPN access to get work done. He's a procurement engineer, by the way. But a lot of his colleagues are not getting that same access. So they're, unfortunately, they can't do the same work that he can. Asif mentions that companies have a duty of care. Perhaps companies should invest in the technology for remote working. Great comment there. Okay. So before we move on from this topic of remote work, we're about halfway through the live stream. Greg, what have you heard that Jamie or Nick said that maybe our audience should take to heart at the top of the list?
Well, so much of this really hits home, I think, literally for people. But I think that one of the important things to think about is whether you've got the facilities to do it, and communicating with your team, your company, your IT team to either help you set it up or to keep it going. That's the most important thing. IT folks, that what is, as Nick said, what is a difficulty for us is 10 seconds for them. Take advantage of your resources just like you would at the office.
Okay. So we're gonna pivot here over to e-commerce, and we're all, at least in this conversation, are very familiar with the role e-commerce has been playing given the environment. In fact, they're one of the few industries that have been hiring on a massive scale to keep the fulfillment and the distribution centers meeting the demand. I think one factoid I saw that the Wall Street Journal reported a few days ago is that Amazon's packages shipped may be as much as 40% over what they were at this point in time last year. And of course, we know the scale that they're referring to there. So let's talk about, what are you, from an e-commerce standpoint, Jamie, what's one or two observations that you have here?
Well, certainly, people are working from home, and by very nature, it means people are shopping from home more. And because of the scale of that, we're seeing a shift in kind of consumer behavior patterns. And that's expected to kind of play out for the long term. But to give you the broad overview of the dynamics in the market at the moment, we are in unprecedented times, as Nick says, and globally we're in a war against this thing. And to borrow a phrase from one of our historical leaders, Winston Churchill, he said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And I think many companies are taking that at the moment and employing that kind of mentality, which is kind of really important, and pivoting, whether that be short term, just to navigate this situation, or to the long term, to new opportunities that will come out of this situation. And many of them are pivoting to e-commerce, whether that be shippers or carriers who are becoming more e-commerce friendly in their operations. But in addition to that, looking at categories, so we've had companies like Apple come out and say they're launching new categories. I've spoken with huge CPG companies behind the scenes who are launching new product ranges to cope with demand. When we were on the pre-call, I think Greg referenced that monitors were 170% up or something like that, thanks to work from home. So there are various different product categories that we're seeing at least a short-term boom, which represent opportunities for folks to kind of pivot at the moment.
So the list that Jamie's referring to, by the way, is some data that we got from our friends at Stackline, and they've got 2 top 100 lists. And I'm just going to show this for anyone that's watching. We got one page of the top 100 fastest growing categories that Jamie was just referencing, and then we got the top 100 fastest declining categories, and we've got some surprises here. But before we talk about your biggest surprises or expectations with these lists, Nick, weigh in on what we're seeing here in the world of e-commerce.
I think obviously a lot of stuff, is expected. I mean, a lot of people are, ordering a lot online. But in terms of the impact on groceries, I know historically that's not something that people have been as receptive to order online. People like to go and choose their steaks or their vegan options when they're going to the store, whatever store you choose, and there has been less kind of willingness to purchase groceries online. So I feel like this could have a larger snowball effect when it comes to generally are people comfortable with ordering their weekly shopping online? Do they feel like you get that quality that you get from in-store? Do you get that replicated with your online experience? And I think if that trust is replicated from the in-store versus online experience, I feel like a lot of people realize that they can just order online in the same way they order a book, or they order their Lego or their batteries or something that we just take for granted as I'm going to go online to buy that. I feel like that might have a snowball effect when it comes to ordering groceries in general.
Yep. Okay. So let's shift gears over to this list, because I think there is no shortage of maybe some things that make you go, based on where things rank on the fastest growing or the fastest declining.
No doubt.
So, Greg, what stood out when you're looking at these two lists that we're talking about from Stackline? What are some of your surprises on either side?
There are some things that are growing fast that you would expect. Healthcare supplies, gloves and masks, of course, that sort of thing. Some surprising things. Apparently, people are making bread at home. Bread machines are up by over 650%.
Amanda agrees with that, by the way.
We already have one, I guess. So we're preppers. That practically makes us preppers. Interestingly, and this I've seen in my own home because I have kids who have allergies. Cough and cold and allergy medicines are up by enormous percentages because nobody wants to have the sniffles right now, right? So no one wants to be a pariah if they were to set foot outside their house, or, among the people that they might be quarantined with, they don't want to have symptoms. So I think people are taking better care of themselves from that standpoint. It's good to see, speaking of taking care of yourself, that weightlifting and home exercise equipment is on the upturn. We are still able to walk as long as we maintain social distance around our home. And I walked past a lady on the other side of the street. We were more than appropriately social distanced, and I could hear her talking to a friend saying, "My husband is going berserk. I can't wait till the new weight bench or whatever it is they had ordered comes in. He needs that." So it's interesting to see some of the things that are increasing pretty dramatically.
All right, so Asif says, Nick, that you are stockpiling toilet paper. I'm not going to let you. I'm not going to force you to speak to that accusation. And it should be pointed out. So Asif is a friend. He's also part of the EFT by Reuters team. So all in good fun. But Nick, kidding aside, speak to some of your surprises when you look at these lists from Stackline.
Yeah, I feel like just echoing Greg's point. I mean, I was very surprised that bread machines was number 2 on the list. You would expect, as Asif said, toilet roll to be high on the list of people stockpiling rather than bread machines. But it's interesting to see people's purchasing decisions. I mean, obviously things like office equipment. Speaking to the conversation we had previously,
Right.
is a lot of people don't have monitors. A lot of people don't have the office equipment that you need to do your job. So I feel like a lot of people are panic buying a desk, panic buying a monitor, and I feel like there is an implication now on, once you replicate the office space, once you replicate the home gym, a lot of this gym equipment is really, really heavy. So how are you going to get that delivered to your house or to your flat or wherever you're living? A lot of these materials are big and bulky, and I think it is putting a strain on certain e-commerce websites to deliver that and fulfill that, because it's a big product, and I feel like that can't be underappreciated.
So, but Jamie, before I get you to weigh in, a couple comments here from our audience I think are fascinating. So Hamant talked about how folks are maybe shying away from e-commerce because of potential contamination of the packages. We've certainly seen some of that in our network. And then Claudia, who's a friend of the show, regular live stream listener, and hopefully we're going to get her on at some point soon. She made an interesting comment that they've changed their e-commerce checkout cart so that partners can mark their order COVID-19 required to help them keep their facilities clean and ready to go. Her organization serves higher education. So that's a really interesting comment. Okay, so Jamie, weigh in on some of the movement we're seeing here, or anything else related to the e-commerce boom or the challenges this current environment present.
Yeah, I think there's some fantastic comments from the listeners there. And I don't necessarily see companies shying away from e-commerce. In fact, what we see and what our data tells us is the opposite, that there's more movement to e-commerce. But that said, there is a real emphasis on baking in health and safety all along the value chain, specifically when you're looking at kind of last mile deliveries, right, where there is some kind of white glove element to the service and a human kind of connection where the good eventually changes hands. And in those kind of situations, it's really important for e-commerce providers to bake in health and safety scenarios, whether that be leaving things at the doorstep at a safe distance, or if you're in need to go into the house to, let's say, put up a cupboard or something like that. How can you do that safely? How can you keep both the customer and the person delivering that good safe? So I think we're definitely seeing a shift to e-commerce, but it has to be done with health and safety being the number one priority. The interesting additional challenge that we see with demand and supply kind of fluctuating is from a planning perspective and an inventory perspective. So how much stock should you keep? Can you, let's say if you have stock which is left in a warehouse or in a brick and mortar store, to what extent can that be redirected into the e-commerce supply chain? Because a lot of retailers will have products which are specifically for e-commerce stores and for brick and mortar stores. So from a planning perspective, I think that's where a significant kind of headache is at the moment. And to kind of counter that, what we see is a huge investment in time, energy, and resource into technology to build better visibility all across the supply chain, because each mutual counterparty is so interconnected. And I think at times like this, where we see disruption, it's so obvious to see what the knock-on effects are downstream. And for that reason, I think there's a real kind of emphasis on visibility and transparency in the supply chain to help manage those kind of inventory levels.
Well put, Jamie. Okay, couple quick comments from the audience. Memory is a buyer from South Africa. And she says, hello from South Africa. Hating the lockdown because they are failing to meet their work targets, which I think everyone's struggling with. And she also mentions that all of their spares for compressors are coming in from Europe. So I think she's implying maybe some different sourcing there. And Ferris mentions, great session, guys. I like Nick's points on wasted office resource. Given that we don't know how long these restrictive measures will last, we try to fight the virus. As we try to fight the virus, we will likely see either a fast track of automation within deliveries and couriers, or a quicker rollout of PPE, protective equipment for drivers. Are we likely to see? Sorry, that was a question. My eyes are failing me. I've got about 17 screens. I'm trying to get some of this content in from our audience. So Ferris's question, if one of y'all want to weigh in, are we going to be expecting more folks to follow in Amazon's footsteps, where they have really frozen certain non-emergency fulfillment? Jamie and Nick, are we going to see a lot more of that?
I'll tackle that one. I think that's a really, really good point there from the comments. I do think that people are going to be fearful, increasingly fearful around unnecessary contact. So what are, workers within a warehouse willing to maybe risk their lives for non-essential items? I'm sure that they're more than willing to do it for essential items that are needed for day-to-day, like toilet paper, like rice, like essential items like that. But less essential items like maybe Lego or even weights for home gyms, are those really required? And do we really need to put workers at risk of spreading this virus in order to fulfill those orders that are non-essential, that aren't needed for the daily lives of people living right now?
All right, so let's keep driving. Let's talk about let's pivot from e-commerce. Let's talk about something I know that all four of us here are really passionate about, which is taking care of our supply chain workforce. There's a couple of the comments I'm not going to be able to get to right now. So all of us, the four of us, are working from home, with our families, certainly here in the Atlanta area, my 3 kids, my wife, and the 2 dogs, right? But there's so many brave individuals, whether it's healthcare or certainly supply chain, that are out there making it happen on behalf of all of us. So let's talk about, Jamie, just how important it is. We've got to keep the workforce safe and healthy and protected, right?
Absolutely. I mean, supply chain has never been so important, and the guys on the front line ought to be recognised and rewarded and get the kind of the hero's welcome they deserve. We bring up war analogies quite a lot of this time, and these folks really are kind of in the trenches, so to speak, and genuinely are putting themselves at risk. I'm blessed to be sat, in a flat and not exposed as other folks are. But not everyone is as fortunate as I am in that respect. And so, I can share my opinions on what ought to be done, but I can really only speak to what I hear from people that I talk to from a research perspective. And there's so much, I'm proud to say, going into supporting folks that are on the front line. So from hazard pay to kind of, a huge kind of emphasis on making sure every single process or procedure in the warehouse, for instance, is as safe as possible. And I think that's really important. If you're a leader of one of these organizations, every single possible risk ought to be mitigated at every single stage. I think the second point is around leadership. And a lot of leaders will be kind of sat behind computers wearing blue shirts like I am, and not necessarily in the trenches with the people that are kind of getting their hands dirty, so to speak. But I think if that is the case, there ought to be an extra effort to be as visible as possible, whether that be over kind of digital platforms like this, and to kind of over communicate, because what you don't want to do as a leader in this situation, in my opinion, is to create a case of do as I say and not what I do, because I think that will only kind of disincentivize and disenfranchise the workforces who are putting themselves at risk and who are literally making the world go round right now. And, you know, if you're a customer and you want to go to the shop and buy some bread or buy some toilet paper, it's because of these guys who are doing that. So it couldn't be more important.
Jamie, absolutely. Guys and the girls out in the workforce, making it happen, driving the trucks, fulfilling orders, shipping, stocking
Running
shelves.
registers. Yeah.
What's that, Greg?
Running registers, all of that. I mean,
Absolutely.
They are right on the front line, right?
So,
Yeah, Greg, that is a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that, because oftentimes we don't necessarily think about that point of sale component that is absolutely part of the retail and the end-to-end supply chain. And they're threatened maybe more so than many other elements of the supply chain, right?
Yeah, they come in contact with every single customer. Every customer goes past the register, right? So
the really interesting dynamic is, so we have these essential services in supply chain, but it's interesting to see the updates on the regulations around this, because there are these kind of ancillary services, and there's something that Nick and I talk about quite a lot in the conversations we have, that support these essential services. So let's say a warehouse, for instance, is deemed an essential service, but maybe the call center that supports that isn't, although the warehouse might become unoperational if it doesn't have that support. So it's interesting if you kind of map out the nodes that contribute to the supply chain, how vastly that kind of spreads.
Agreed. And, you know, one headline, we're talking about supply chain workforce safety and the absolute imperative. We've got to keep this workforce safe and healthy and protected. You know, there's a headline on today's news about how some of the meat packing plants were shutting down some production lines today, maybe for several days, maybe, who knows, maybe for a few weeks, because of some of the new cases there. So, you know, there's so much work to do. There's so much exposure. You know, our truck drivers, which here in the States, Nick and Jamie, I think when you look at freight by weight, they move about 70% of all freight. And, you know, we've seen truck stops close, and we're seeing some establishments not offer some of the resources that truck drivers depend on.
rest stop.
You know,
Yeah.
absolutely. So no shortage of challenging factors. But Nick, weigh in on how, you know, what we're talking about here. Again, the imperative that we've got to work together to flatten the curve as much as possible, because that puts less. I would argue that puts the supply chain workforce. It's a less amount of time. It's a shorter period of time. They've got this current set of circumstances to fight through, right?
Yeah, I feel like a point that really can't be underappreciated. I think I spoke about it before, was kind of the mental health aspect of things. I mean, it is quite easy for a lot of people to get overwhelmed with the situation we're in. You see, you know, these crazy statistics about people contracting the virus, how many people are sadly passing away. In the UK, we saw our Prime Minister Boris Johnson going into intensive care yesterday, and the expectation is a lot of these supply chain workers are like robots. These drivers are like robots and will just go ahead as usual. And I do feel like that those support systems from the employee's perspective are so critical to help these people be in the right state of mind to do these things that are so critical to keeping the supply chains moving, because we can't take them for granted as robots, as just people that aren't affected by these crazy times that we're living in.
Yep. A couple comments from the audience here, and then Greg, I want to get you to weigh in. Asif mentions there's a clear business need to automate to mitigate bottlenecks. We've seen certainly a continued investment in robotics and automation. That will undoubtedly continue. Thomas here on LinkedIn mentions glad to see final mile support from couriers like Roadie to keep people at home. Interesting comment there. And then Ferris says, here in the UK, we're seeing many unprepared local and small businesses with online presence shutting down as much of the business will move to online players. Will there be some items which can't be substituted by large companies? That's an interesting question. Greg, you want to weigh in on that possible lack of the ability to shift to get some of the products we need to look, you know, from large companies that are more robust?
Well, let me start with the small companies and move to the large companies, because if you're a small company, it's much, much easier for you to get online than it is for a large company. Here in the States, we've got Shopify. In Europe, they've got Zalando and various other avenues that enable you to do that and do it simply through your website. So if you're a small company and you're closed down anyway, I would encourage you to go to WordPress or Shopify or somewhere and figure out how to get online, because you really have nothing to lose. It's relatively inexpensive. You don't even have to have, in a lot of cases, you don't have to have your own hard banking account. Shopify does that for you. Several other companies provide that for you. There's a bit of a fee there, but certainly, yes, please do that, because this country, and many countries were built on the backs of small businesses, because no business starts out as a big business.
Well put.
To the latter point, which is will larger companies start to pick up where these companies fall off? Absolutely, they will. If they see enough volume for the kind of products that these companies were providing, they probably already are anyway. The truth is, when you lose a small business, you don't lose necessarily a batch of cookies. You lose the batch of cookies that has that particular flavor that you love, or that person that puts that special bit of care when they pack your package, or something like that. So I think it's important to protect that. And I think the protection of that starts with the business itself. And I implore you, small businesses, to get involved in e-commerce. It is so easy these days.
Yeah.
Just speaking to that. Jamie and I work in an edgy part of London in Shoreditch, where you have a lot of boutique shops that are doing cool hipster things, and they must be really struggling right now. And I feel like that cultural aspect of things could potentially get lost if these large retailers start trying to replicate what they're doing. And I feel like that kind of community, that cultural aspect of things is really needed from a lot of these companies. So I feel like we need the support networks to help them online with the challenges around how to support online fulfillment, how to help them when it comes to payment terms, things like that, in order to kind of maintain their cultural importance for a lot of societies we live in.
Great point.
Yeah.
Great point.
It will only be lost temporarily, Nick. Let me assure you. I mean, the world has been through events like this in the past and come through with more small businesses, not fewer. Because as people who start small businesses are people who've typically left a larger company, right? So we might lose a certain aspect of it, or of that small segment of culture, or we might lose it temporarily, but have faith, it will come back.
Yep. And Claudia mentions Etsy is a good example of organizations that are protecting, some of those things, Nick, that you're speaking to, which is a great point, by the way. All right, so we've got to shift gears. We've got just a few minutes left in this live stream. I want to use something that Asif, one of our audience members, is sharing to move into just a couple minutes on automation. So Asif says, we're seeing a lot of items not in stock. The ease of e-commerce is exhausting stocks. The bigger question is e-commerce exposing inefficiencies in supply chain? So with that as a question, Nick, why don't we stick with you? Weigh in on what we're seeing from a robotics and automation standpoint, and what the next few months looks like in that regard.
I think in terms of the discussion around automation, it is easy to kind of point to that as maybe an easy kind of saving grace, as a silver bullet, as it were. But a lot of these products that we are buying are bought in various parts of the world, and it does take a certain amount of time to source something from various parts of the world. And I think there needs to be an appreciation that for a ship to come from China to San Francisco, it takes a certain amount of time. So maybe it's a more kind of existential discussion around, do I really need my Lego within 24 hours, or can I wait for my Lego for 5 working days? I feel like we do live in a society that does need stuff right now. Obviously, certain items like important, drugs, important vitamins are needed right now. But do people really need that book, in 24 hours? Do they need it to come so quickly, or can they wait for it for 5 days, for 6 days, for 7 days? So I think that's kind of a broader discussion that maybe needs to be had. That's kind of the more important discussion to have.
Okay, Nick, thank you for that. Jamie, your quick, succinct, hot take on robotics, automation, and gaining efficiencies.
Yeah, so to keep it very short, what we see in our research and our data is not necessarily risk being exposed, although it is, but it's more opportunity that is being exposed. I think what shippers particularly realize now is the need for transparency and immediacy of information. And the more they invest in automation, the easier that becomes. So you need to know where product is right now, as opposed to have like a period of a day or a week, which a year or two ago would have been fine. So I think that's where automation is being invested in.
Great point, Jamie. All right, Greg, I know you're dying to talk robotics and automation. What's your quick take here?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I think one of the things that we can't ignore is diversification of sourcing. If we haven't realized yet that we are way too reliant on China and that's a danger, let me just say we are way too reliant on China, and that is a danger. There, I've said it. Now, to automation, I think the other thing that if we reduce our reliance on China, that mandates is incredible production capacity, because in truth, that's what China's draw is: incredible production capacity at relatively low cost. And in order to do that, automation is necessary. I'm less inclined to think that automation will come at the last mile, at the delivery end, or even at the shipping end in great measure, as we've seen evidenced by the hiring that's been done by Walmart and Amazon and others to try to fulfill orders. Obviously, that's much, much harder to do. But the thing we have to acknowledge, and this is another opportunity to recognize this, is that we are going through now one of the greatest generational transitions of our time. The largest human generation in history is leaving the workforce at the rate of 10,000 people per day. We cannot replace that workforce, and we must then use automation to augment it. And to me, that spells, and I think this is a great uplifting thing for us. For once, we can embrace automation without putting people out of work, because we can't replace everyone who's leaving the workforce today anyway.
Good point, Greg. And so Thomas also mentioned something to consider that we haven't touched on, and we can't touch on today just at a time. B2B demand is shifting to B2C, which of course is shifting to a different fulfillment channel. That is an interesting comment, because that also plays into some of the complexity we're seeing. So good stuff there, Thomas.
Brilliant adaptation of the supply chain, however, though. Going to your local restaurant to get rice if your grocery store doesn't have it, right?
That's a good point.
Good point. Quick example.
All right, so Nick and Jamie, I hate to kind of come to a screeching halt here. We're gonna have y'all back on and continue some of these hot topics in supply chain in light of what we're seeing with COVID-19. But let's make sure folks can connect with both of you and tap into all the resources and thought leadership that the EFT by Reuters Events team offers. Nick.
So yeah, I feel like now more than ever, as we've said throughout this, the right information is needed. I'm sure a lot of people are on some rogue WhatsApp groups where aunties and uncles are sharing some things that they shouldn't, and there's anecdotes on how to beat COVID-19 and all sorts of conspiracy theories. I feel like now more than ever we need information to help people that are looking for that information, because they are confused and quite concerned with what's going on. So we're taking as well as you guys with your platform, that responsibility to provide up-to-date fact-driven content with a lot of the business leaders that we have in our network to provide a lot of the folks solutions to their everyday challenges, whether it is, labor demand in their warehouses, or keeping, drivers safe during these times, or to take advantage of this boom in e-commerce. So yeah, we'll be bringing out a lot more material, a lot more digital content over the next few weeks to really help folks with these ongoing struggles.
Terrific. And you can find Nick on LinkedIn, and you can also learn more at EFT.com, right, Nick?
Yep, that's correct.
And Jamie, what about you? Your final thought here, and how can folks connect with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, but yeah, I would just repeat what Nick said. We're bringing out a lot of content like you guys to kind of help the industry through this time and come together to share ideas and opinion, so we can all kind of get through this together. So that's essentially what we'll be providing.
Outstanding. Looking forward to our webinar next week on global visibility. The huge emphasis on visibility is nothing new. I think when we see challenges like this, it's even more important that we have visibility into all nooks and crannies of our global supply chain. So looking forward to joining both of y'all next week on that webinar. And to our audience, you can sign up for that free webinar at supplychainnowradio.com or at EFT.com as well. And we'd love to have you join us. It's also in the show notes. The direct link to that webinar is in the show notes of this episode, regardless what channel that you're tuning into with. All right, Greg, before we sign off today, your final thought?
I think aside from all of the important things that we've said here today, I think it's important to recognize that almost 37% of the workforce globally is engaged in supply chain. That means about 1.1 billion people around the world are engaged in supply chain, 44 million alone in the US. So this is an important part of our world and our industry going forward. And as we're all learning, it is the lifeblood of all of those materials and equipment and food and supplies that we so desperately need in good times and in bad. So learn, if you're not already a supply chain professional, learn something, get engaged with one, learn as much as you can about supply chain, because it is the life's blood. We used to be an agrarian society where 40% of the population was engaged in that, and now nearly 40% of the population is engaged in moving goods. So it's one of the most important things on our planet. To give you some perspective, if supply chain were a sport, only soccer, cricket, and field hockey would have more fans than supply chain has participants.
Well, one of the silver linings, and we talked about this pre-show, is that the emphasis on supply chain, the profession, the key functions that it provides, the key conveniences that successful supply chain management provides society. I think we're going to have a lot more interest and enthusiasts in the supply chain management profession. So with that, I want to thank our featured guests here today, Jamie Harding and Nick Stylianou. Both are with the incredible team over at EFT by Reuters Events. Connect with both of them on LinkedIn, and you can also learn more at EFT.com. Be sure to check out a variety of thought leadership resources, podcasts, live streams, webinars over at supplychainnowradio.com. And find us and subscribe to wherever you get your podcast from. If you've enjoyed this conversation, check out our podcast programming. And again, we've already mentioned the webinar next week. The direct link to it is conveniently in the show notes wherever you're tuning into this live stream. On behalf of Greg White, Amanda, Dog, the whole team here at Supply Chain Now,
and the kids,
and the dogs, you name it. Stay safe, everybody. Listen to the precautions that your local healthcare institutions are sharing. Don't panic. We're going to break through. And when we do, we're going to throw one heck of a party. So Nick, Jamie, y'all take care. Greg, we'll see you soon. To our audience, stay safe, and we'll see you next time on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.